Center, which is located in Building 10, Room 180. It was also possible because of the Ethnic Studies Department, specifically Dr. Malathia Yangar, and because of DIAC, the Diversity in Action Grant, that sponsored this. I'm super excited to be the one hosting it and presenting it to you today. This wouldn't be possible without the extensive labor of everyone I've met throughout the years, both inside and outside of this academic institution. I'd like to say thanks to EOPS and everyone that has encouraged folks to come out to this event today. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce this year's Scholar Interns at the Multicultural Dream Center. I'll start with myself. My name is Daniel Casillas. I'm the Special Projects intern here at College of San Mateo, and I'm working on 2 events this semester. Two projects. One of the projects is this event here, and another project is going to be building a library at the Multicultural and Dream Center to make it accessible for students. And then I'd like to introduce Diana. She's our LGBTQ program scholar intern, and their project is Cutie Chats. Cutie Chats stands for Queer and Trans Chats. It is a place where LGBTQ folks and their allies can come together to build community around issues that are pertaining to the community. And also just hold up space, I think that's very important. And Diana also does good work in collaboration with the Pride Center here in San Mateo. That's Diana. And then next we have Domaris. Domaris is our undocumented student support intern, and their project this semester is working on a short film on behalf of the Multicultural and Dream Center to kind of introduce people to the center, as well as hosting undocu-circles. So undocu-circles is essentially a space where undocumented students and their allies can come together to essentially build community around various identities that might intersect with each other, as well as just organize and be present with each other. Next, I have Ariel. Ariel's the former foster youth scholar intern.
Right here. In the back.
She's filming it in the back. And Ariel's project is to build a strong community around former foster youth in our CSM campus. This includes events such as spoken word, know your rights workshops, and resource workshops. And then second to last, we have Tony, and she is our outreach. She's back there. She's our outreach specialist scholar intern, and you might know her because she's presenting in so many classrooms and just in so many different spaces, like in high schools as well. So I'm still surprised she's talking and walking. And she's also in charge of our bi-weekly newsletter. And what this newsletter does is essentially it provides a variety of different opportunities for folks that may not know about certain scholarships, certain events that are happening both within this community, but in the greater Bay Area too. So I would highly recommend y'all to sign up for the newsletter. And also, lastly, we have Joanna. Joanna is the operational scholar intern. So if you ever come to the center, she's usually going to be the one working at the desk, and she'll be able to help you out with some of your needs. Just come say hi to us at the Multicultural and Dream Center. And I just want to say, can we give a round of applause for our interns and all the amazing work they're doing? Okay, so as you can see, all the work that we're kind of doing at the Multicultural and Dream Center pertains to social justice. And all of it looks different in many ways. It can be supporting students that are traditionally not supported through these academic institutions. It can be by some of the events that they're hosting, and just simply existing on these campuses. So just to segue into that, we are currently hiring for the Multicultural Dream Center for next year, and it's a 1-year commitment for any students that may be looking for a job on campus. We have good pay, and this actually has a very good professional kind of development for you to put on your resume that actually pertains to your career. I just wanted to let y'all know that we're currently hiring for the 2019-2020 academic year. And what this is intended to do is build peer-to-peer empowerment through culturally relevant and equity and justice-minded student support services. The MCCDC is a safe haven for underrepresented students in college settings, including students of color, AB 540 students, undocumented students, former foster youth, ESL students, and LGBTQ+ students. Rooted in social justice and activism, community empowerment, the MCCDC provides a safe space for students to implement change in our communities. If you are interested in becoming an agent in social change, please sign up for the newsletter, as we will give more information on it through there. So many of y'all may be wondering how you can support the Multicultural Dream Center. So we are currently hosting a fundraiser right now that you can access through the collegeofsanmateo.edu/multicultural. And essentially there's going to be a tab for donations there. And what that does is it allows us to host events like these, pay certain scholar interns that are not able to get work study for whatever reason, and also have food at these events. So if you are able to, please do so. And now I'd like to introduce the Multicultural Dream Center and how it came to be in its capacity of today. The Multicultural Dream Center, as well as EOPS, came out of the College Readiness Program, a program that was maintained by students for students to support and collectively ensure that they are in charge of their own education and not the other way around. I'd like to pay tribute to our countless warriors, both in CRP and beyond, that have came before us, and to acknowledge the land we are currently on, the Ramaytush Ohlone land, and to acknowledge that there are still Native people on this land. Recently, in 2016, students in our district unified. Students came together to organize, to stand in opposition of arming officers on our campus. Many were students of color organizing against this policy because of the realities many of us face in our communities in the larger so-called United States. Shortly after, the political climate changed rapidly, and we, students, faculty, staff, and community members geared into action. We formed what would be known as SMCCD Rise Up. We were a collective of students from Kenyatta College, College of San Mateo, and Skyline College. We dedicated countless days, nights, weeks, and months to support the most impacted students in our district. To name a few: undocumented students, students with disabilities or differently abled folks, women, queer, and gender nonconforming students, formerly incarcerated students, Muslim students, and many other vulnerable students that may be targeted due to the political climate. Students used many avenues to bring change to our district. After a few months, students held a walkout on all three sister colleges. The basis of the walkout was to present the 12 demands that students formulated and demonstrate the solidarity and action that we, the people, are capable of. After the walkouts, the Board of Trustees did an affirmation of social justice, a very critical document for students and future students. If we fast forward to today, the MCCDC has become a big space that was not there before 2016. The Multicultural Dream Center has transformed to be student-ran and centered, as the scholar interns are taking on new challenges and steps to assist everyone that comes inside the center. At this time, I'd like to remind everyone that this event would not be possible without the Diversity in Action grant. With that being said, please make sure to fill out the survey or you won't be able to leave. No, I'm just playing. Wink, wink. But as an incentive for filling out the survey, you will be able to receive one of the pins I am currently wearing. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jason Ferreira. His day job is he's assistant professor and chair on the Race of Resistance Studies at San Francisco State University in the nation's only College of Ethnic Studies. He's the co-founder with Benita Martinez on the Institute of Multiracial Justice. He's co-founder of the Political Education Center, or the Center for Political Education, and he's a board member of the Freedom Archives. He's a member of Left Roots and a father of two 4-year-old daughters, twins. So without further ado, this is Dr. Jason Ferreira.
Twins right here. Put this here. Let me know if you can't hear me. Yes. Good afternoon. power to the people. All right. It's kind of still here at San Mateo. A little better than Berkeley, to be sure. I don't know, you might have to work on a little bit to catch up to SF State, but a little friendly political rivalry is never wrong. So it is an honor to be here at the College of San Mateo. You know, you write an article and you don't know who's going to read it. It disappears into the abyss. And then somebody says it's actually getting read and it's actually resonating with folk. And this is great because I didn't write that history of the College Readiness Program and the movement here at the College of San Mateo for my own benefit. This is your history. This is your history whether you realize it or not. And so it's really rewarding and really an honor to be here to join in conversation with you. So thank you for the invitation. All right. In response to the unfolding sit-in movement and the subsequent founding of an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I don't know if you're familiar with this. In 1960, students started, the movement started obviously before 1960 with the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks, but in 1960, students started sitting in at segregated lunch counters. And that catalyzed into a student movement, formed a student organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the rest is history, as they say. But in response to the sit-in movement and the founding of this defining organization, Ella Baker, how many people in here have heard of Ella Baker before? So, okay, let me see. How many people have heard about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Heard that name before? Okay. Ella Baker is as significant as people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But because she wasn't a minister and because she wasn't a man, history books have not given her her proper due. She, in many ways, is the architect, the glue that brought so many people together in what we think of as the modern Black freedom struggle during the 1960s. But in the context of this burgeoning movement in 1960, she penned an article that she published in a publication called Southern Patriot. And it was called, the title of the piece was called Bigger Than a Hamburger. And in this article, she sought to remind people that what lay at the heart of the movement was, quote, to rid America of the scourge of racial segregation and discrimination, not only at lunch counters, but in every aspect of life. She would then go on to say further, this is, quote, not limited to a drive for personal freedom or even freedom for the Negro in the South, but is concerned with racial discrimination for the whole world and the human race, end quote. In other words, what I'm saying is that the architects of the civil rights movement at this early date clearly understood themselves as fighting for something more, something deeper than desegregation, something beyond integration into U.S. civil society, but rather was something that opened outwards to a range of issues that were cultural, that were economic, that were political. Again, every aspect of life, and to struggles of oppressed peoples across the globe. I start my talk about third world student struggles in the Bay Area here in the late 1960s and the creation of ethnic studies with this important quote by Ella Baker, because just as she framed the movement as something bigger than a hamburger, bigger than being able to sit down next to white patrons in a diner to eat a hamburger, the struggle for ethnic studies is much bigger than a syllabus, much deeper than diversifying the curriculum or the student body, as important as those goals are. Memory matters, and how we remember the movements within higher education profoundly shape our contemporary understanding of current political possibilities. So as we celebrate 50 years of ethnic studies, 50 years of struggle, 50 years of resistance, we're still confronted with vital questions about what actually happened, who was involved, who provided leadership, and most significantly, what were these struggles all about? Now, many histories of the 1960s, following the newspapers of the era, always focus on like the big, spectacular, dramatic events. And the Bay Area was definitely the epicenter of a lot of dramatic, spectacular events, spectacular actions. Think about it. The occupation of Alcatraz in the fall of 1969, the forced eviction of the Manam, the elderly Filipinos at the International Hotel, were forcibly removed in August of 1977, or the clashes between police and striking students at places like San Francisco State or at UC Berkeley, or in the case of here, the College of San Mateo, as you read, the quote-unquote riots of December 1968. I'll get back to that in a second. So lots of spectacular action. Yet media attention is a double-edged sword. A double-edged sword for the movements of the 1960s, and I'll argue is a double-edged sword for us today. Folks were able during that era to creatively use technology, use the media to shine a light upon injustice, and in many respects, that was part of the strategy. Today we often talk about social media activism and what that brings to our toolbox of struggle. But it's important to recognize that media attention cuts another way too. As I say, it's a double-edged sword. Because if we don't control the media, our movements, our demands can be watered down or just as frequently vilified. It's important to note that stories of quote-unquote violent militants of color sold tons of copy. Newspapers knew that they could speak to anxiety-ridden white folk who were concerned with urban rebellions and urban riots, whether it's Watts in 65, Hunters Point in 66, all on down the line. But worse, for movements, for those of us on our side, strategies that depend upon the media often end up shifting focus away from grassroots empowerment to getting that constant fix, always needing greater media attention, sustained media attention, and with that, all the gendered and class politics that go along with that. So as an activist historian, drawing upon newspapers to reconstruct the meaning of a movement or of a moment inevitably distorts our understanding of the underlying story. So we need to go beyond. We need to go beneath the spectacular. The great revolutionary historian, Pan-African historian C.L.R. James would write back in the late 1930s, in 1938, in a classic book on the Haitian Revolution. Now, everybody talk about the Age of Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, but it's only the Haitian Revolution that went all the way and abolished slavery in the early 1800s. But it's a history that we're not taught, right? Because of the lessons of that particular revolution for all plantation societies, the U.S. included. So this book, The Black Jacobins, which he wrote in the midst of the Great Depression, is a very important book. And he says in it, though, in a revolution, when the ceaseless, slow accumulation of centuries bursts into volcanic eruption, the meteoric flares and flight above are meaningless chaos and lend themselves to an infinite caprice and romanticism, unless the observer sees them as always a projection of the subsoil from which they came, end quote. And this is what I attempted to do in my piece on the College of San Mateo, on the College Readiness Program, on the student movement here on this campus, to excavate a bit of that subsoil, to reveal that there was something much deeper than just a series of physical clashes that took place in which some windows got broken and the police came in and cracked some skulls. No, students here at the College of San Mateo were part of a revolution, an attempt to revolutionize education, to establish a more emancipatory educational practice that could not just rewrite a curriculum, but would also, or remake a student body, but would in fact remake the world. And this is important. This history is important to recover and reclaim because actually, just like the Haitian Revolution, this is a history that has been subjugated, purposefully kept from people because of the legacies that it provides, because of the lessons it provides. And while usually media attention always pays attention to the elite universities, you know, the Columbia universities, the Cornells, the UCLAs, the Berkeleys, actually most of the organizing that took place at working class institutions. Working class institutions like CSU, in California that means where? The CSU, and especially the community colleges. And we have to understand that. We have to understand that the UCs, which enroll in, 200-some-thousand students statewide, the CSUs enroll a little over 500,000, but the community colleges enroll over 2.2 million students in this state. These are the institutions. These are the places in which most Californians get their education. We have to recognize this. And so if there's going to be change, it's going to come from you all. It's not going to come from Bert. Okay, so my understanding is that many of you have been reading the piece that I wrote on the College of San Mateo. So I'm not here today to sort of walk you through that essay. If you're reading it in class, you still got to read it. And if you're not in the class, I encourage you to read it. So I'm not going to spend time going over that history. Instead, what I'd like to talk about today, and Daniel, please cut me off when you need to, because I can talk. Instead, what I want to talk about today is what transpired here at the College of San Mateo as being part of a wider network, a key node of resistance in a larger web of struggle that tied together multiple campuses and multiple communities. It's not a coincidence that a third world liberation front emerged here at the College of San Mateo, emerged at San Francisco State, emerged at UC Berkeley, emerged at Mission High School, emerged at high schools all across the Bay. In fact, they even emerged in other places of the country. But the epicenter, that web of struggle that I want to talk about today is very, very strong here in the Bay Area. And what united them? A common dream. What Robin Kelly might refer to as a set of freedom dreams. A new type of education, a relevant education. One that could realize self-determination both within oppressed people, that is, addressing internalized racism, but also across oppressed communities. The project of ethnic studies, or what people pushed for at the time, which was called Third World Studies, was not a legacy of the struggle, not meant to be a fruit of struggle, but instead a vehicle of struggle, a base for the movement. Okay? So what I want to do, and if I can't get to all three, maybe we can get to it, some of it in the Q&A, but I want to speak about three general points about this regional third world student movement, and then look forward to that collective discussion. So what are those three fundamental characteristics? Point number one, serve the people. The development of a new praxis, a new way, a new theory of action in education. That is to revolutionize education itself. Now, education in communities of color has always been a focal point of struggle. It's always been central to freedom struggles, to an expansion of democracy. During Reconstruction following the Civil War, public schools were constructed across the South. African American communities sought to make freedom actually mean something by investing in education. In the 20th century, the famous 1954 Supreme Court case decision of Brown v. Board of Education is emblematic of that same democratic impulse to desegregate education. It's a watershed moment in the fight against educational inequality, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. In other communities, in the Chicano community, in the Mexican American community, Chicano community, I don't mean Mexican, or definitely not Hispanic. In 1947, in the Mendez versus Westminster case, which actually served as a legal precedent for Brown, the segregation of Mexican children was deemed unconstitutional. So education has always been central to our freedom struggles. But as important as access is, and has always been, members of the Third World Liberation Front on all of these different campuses sought to, as I say, remake education. How so? They sought to develop an educational practice that differed from the notion that you went to college to escape the community, to get out the hood, to get out the barrio, right? To maybe at best serve as a role model for those who would come up behind you, right? Going to school for individual success, individual mobility. But rather, ethnic studies was part of a philosophy that it was the responsibility of people to return to the community, to return particularly to working class communities, to marginalized communities, to contribute to collective struggle within the community. And in so doing, break the traditional divide between the campus and the community. This campus is beautiful. But one of the things that you notice about it, I'm sure, is you're up on a hill, looking down on the flats, right? So the goal of ethnic studies, whether it was here at CSM or San Francisco State or Berkeley, was to break that divide between campus and community. to promote a notion of what Archbishop Oscar Romero would say in his work with the poor of El Salvador before he was assassinated by the CIA assassins, that it is the responsibility to accompany those who are most marginalized, to stand on the side of the most oppressed. But it is also to acknowledge that, and to highlight that knowledge doesn't come because you've got 3 letters after your name. PhD, okay? Don't let that fool you. I went to Berkeley. I've gone to some of the, as Curtis Mayfield once said, you know, I've gone to educated schools and met lots of uneducated fools, you know? Lots of people with PhDs. That does not mean they have knowledge. We have knowledge in our communities, right? That already exists within our communities. So part of the goal of education, part of the rethinking of education was to recognize that knowledge exists in our communities, to eliminate the distinction between theory and practice, between thinking and doing, between the person who works with their hands, right? As many of us maybe coming from working class backgrounds have family members who work with their hands, and those who work with their brain, right? Quote unquote intellectuals. That's a false distinction between the two. So this is a radical rethinking about education and educational practice. How did they do so? How did individuals seek to develop this educational practice at CSM, at State, at Berkeley, etc.? Programmatic development. I know that sounds boring. Programmatic development that was intended to working class realities, to build individual and the collective capacities. To build individual and collective capacities. And that doesn't just mean transforming one's consciousness, becoming, as I almost sound like an old guy here, not, you young folk talking about being woke, right? Woke ain't enough. Consciousness is not enough. Lots of people are woke. Like, if we think about that metaphor, you could be laying in bed, woke, awake, doesn't mean you're actually doing anything. The idea is to be conscious and involved. Knowledge, even alternative knowledge, as important as it may be, in ethnic studies we always say, no history, no self. It's very popular today. But we have to recognize that knowledge alone has never been able to defeat oppression, imperialism, capitalism. Knowledge alone. That takes work, that takes practice, that takes struggle. And that's what the college readiness program was attempting to do, was attempting to build consciousness in a way that was connected to working class realities, to the whole student, as I wrote about in that piece. That you can't just parachute working class students of color onto a college campus and just say sink or swim. That in order for that student to be successful, in order to address issues of equity, one has to attend to everything that makes up that student. And in so doing, that student is connected to community, connected to collectivities. And I'll refer to some of the ways in which Aaron Manganiello describes that in that piece. So we have to, the argument went, involve oneself in the community, grappling with material realities of people's lives. And these material realities are still with us today. Poverty, substandard housing, police brutality, la migra. So we need to, and they sought to, at all of these campuses, create spaces where people could both remake oneself and remake the world. Now, here at the College of San Mateo, it doesn't really, my article doesn't really end on the most uplifting note, right? Because the movement here faced intense political repression. Okay, people like Bob Hoover, people like Aaron Manganiello had to go on and do other things, right? Create the Nairobi College, or to create Venceremos College off campus because they were driven off of campus. But in other places, there were some successes. College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State. How much time?
10 minutes. 15.
Okay. Well, in that case, let me make some stuff up. No, but every single campus had this. The Black Student Union at San Francisco State. Programmatic development. they developed a tutorial program, right? And that tutorial program was a place that members of the Black Student Union were engaged in tutorial in the Western Addition, in Fillmore, in Bayview Hunters Point, but not just in black communities, also in Chinatown, the Mission District, right? Of taking students, involving them in the community, working with members of the community. But here's the thing, as that happened, it wasn't just about developing academic skills, critical consciousness, that was all part of it. But inevitably, it meant involving oneself in the struggles of the community. So, for instance, in the Western Addition, in the Fillmore at the time, the Black Student Union, as a result of their deep engagement in the neighborhood, became involved in the struggle against redevelopment. They became members of an organization called the WACO, the Western Addition Community Organization, to push back against the urban, what people refer to as the time as Negro removal, urban renewal, right? Not too dissimilar from contemporary struggles around gentrification, right? The ways in which working class communities of color are getting cleansed across the Bay Area. So for these students, it wasn't just about studying, it was about action and involvement and learning from elders in the community in the process. Asian American Studies, I'll use as another example. When Asian American Studies at San Francisco State was created, they actually had classes that worked in the I Hotel, the International Hotel. Do folks know what I mean when I say that, International Hotel? The struggle around the International Hotel? Okay. First of all, there's a film. I think you can watch it on YouTube. It's called The Fall of the I Hotel. Okay. So, but the International Hotel was a defining struggle within the Asian American movement. Oh my God. It's an important struggle, okay? But what it was an attempt to evict one of the last bastions of the Filipino community in San Francisco, of elderly men who lived in single-room occupancy hotels, right around North Beach and the financial district, right? And they were being evicted because they wanted to build a parking lot for all the yuppies who were driving in from the suburbs to park their cars downtown, right? And so this whole community was being evicted. And so that served as a flashpoint of struggle, and Asian American Studies was involved in that struggle. So they would take a class on Asian American urban policy, read the reports, read everything, but then also engage themselves in the community and work with the elders to defend them so that they could stay in their home. Do you see what I mean about study and action, theory and practice? They go hand in hand. It's not a coincidence that the occupation of Alcatraz largely comes out of Native American studies at State and at Berkeley. Now, obviously, these are all things that are dedicated to a sort of movement ends. But if you really think about it, the business school does this. Anybody here in business? One person? Two people? You'll see that the business school, you'll learn about marketing and everything like that, and then they'll put you in an internship. So that you can come out the other end saying, not only do I know the ideas, but I've also had practice, right? I've also done as well as studied, okay? Now, of course, we're not talking about selling commodities here or anything like that, right? Trying to make money for the Gap or Amazon or some other company. We're talking about our communities in this regard. Okay. Point number 2. Third world unity and internationalism. This is another common characteristic across all the campuses. Divide and conquer is a self-conscious strategy that all of the multiple systems that are arrayed against us have utilized. And so as such, they have and we must take seriously and privilege, foreground the sentiment expressed by the Maya of In La Quech. Tú eres mi otro yo. You are the other me. That we are not individuals. We are connected to one another. And in all of these cases, College of San Mateo within the College Readiness Program and Third World Liberation Front, SF State, Berkeley, new forms of community took shape, and took shape within the context of struggle, within the heat of struggle. Not as allies, okay? Not as allies, okay? I'm actually opposed to allies. I know that sounds weird. You know why I'm opposed to allies? We need accomplices. We need, I'll use the language of the time, comrades. There's a distinction to be made between allies and comrades. Allies presume that there's some sort of natural difference or boundary between you and I, that we might, today, yes, tomorrow, no, come together around a particular issue. Comrades reflect something much larger, something much grander, something much more deep. This is not to say that I'm talking about a solidarity of sameness, that we're all the same, but instead, it's about a commitment to a politics. A commitment to a politics that's rooted in the notion of unity in diversity, about constructing an expansive identity, not a contracting identity. And this can only be forged in struggle. Unity is a process, not a thing you have. It's something you commit to develop. It's something that happens between people within relationships in motion, okay? You don't just say, hey, we got unity. No, it doesn't work that way. You have to work for it, you know? And it can be difficult, and it was difficult. But developing trust, generosity, are central components of doing so. The opposite of what many of us see today in the so-called call-out culture. So, examples. The BSU at San Francisco State were the ones who kind of first put out the notion of a Third World Liberation Front. Third World Liberation Front was formed late 67, early 68 at SF State. Early 68 is when it became public, but it was in the works since late 67. Why? Because the Black Student Union, who was the most sophisticated political organization on that campus, recognized the need that in order for Black studies to be realized, in order to transform that institution into the things I was just talking about, allies would be necessary. No. Comrades would be necessary, right? But other groups, organizations on that campus, like the Latino groups, the Asian American groups, were not as politically developed, right? They had not gone through what the Black community had already been going through, thanks to, the civil rights movement and Malcolm X, who had been assassinated by 65, and the developing Black Power movement of the Black Panther Party. And so they helped create an infrastructure by which they could develop comrades, but also develop the political capacities of other communities of color, right? Because other communities of color also looked in the mirror and said, now I know my name is Carlos, but why am I referring to myself as Chuck, right? And I know that I know I'm brown, but I really wish I was white. Because when I look at the magazines, when I look at the media, everything is white, right? In terms of that internalized racism, dealing with that internalized racism. The Black Student Union was instrumental in creating the space by which that could happen, right? And they used the language of the third world to sort of serve as that umbrella, right? 5 minutes. Okay, let me move on to, so Third World Liberation Front, the other part of that is the Liberation Front, right? Third World Liberation Division that people at San Mateo were fighting for. The liberation part is not just a throwaway word, right? Again, think back to what I was saying about Ella Baker, about integrating into the institution or transforming society. Third, and this is maybe, I don't know, we'll see how this one goes, but it's important. And that is, all of them were critical of liberalism. All of them were critical of middle-of-the-roaders, right? With the rise of Reagan in the 1980s, sometimes we think of the 60s as a struggle between the conservatives and the liberals, okay? Because conservatives have sought to crush anything associated with the 1960s. But in fact, it was way more complicated. What often propelled events was actually a critique and a conflict with liberals. Dr. King would say, Riots don't develop out of the thin air. Conditions continue to exist in our society which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. And in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has continued or has failed to hear? The plight of the Negro has worsened over the years. It's failed to hear the promises of freedom and justice that have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned with tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. So our histories have been distorted. And when our histories are distorted, our horizons of possibility are constrained. We think that the liberal agenda is the best that we can get. But when in fact, these movements propose something much more radical, much more fundamental. Public education as free, right? This division between UC, CSU, and the community college was rooted partially in the idea following 1960 that everybody should have public education, but it was also a way in which to structure the political economy of higher education that would drive working class students, and working class students of color in particular, from the UCs into the community colleges, into vocational education, as opposed to getting a PhD, okay? But to say that liberalism was in conflict with radicals is not to say that reform was viewed as irrelevant. We need to think outside the box. But we need to think outside of the box in a way that recognizes that what's necessary, what all these movements sought to do, is within that box, heighten the contradictions to the point that we can transform said box. Okay? The notion of we can be autonomous outside the box, so to speak, right, outside the institution, that has its contradictions too. Nairobi College and the Vincent Amos College, which were outside of the College of San Mateo, after the CRP was crushed, they're no longer with us either, right? They struggled as well. In other words, there is no outside the system. And we have to sort of go beyond either or thinking. We need to be able to do both. Audre Lorde wrote a very famous piece called, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. But I think there's anybody ever heard that article before? Read that article before? It's a very popular article, but I think sometimes we misread that piece. Because she's pushing for, in that piece, going beyond either or thinking. The context of her argument is important. She doesn't call for not using the master's tools. Okay? What she's saying, and in fact she's even saying the master's tools are useless. Only that the dominant tools, right, are limited. That they will not bring about freedom. Integration into the system will not bring freedom. A diverse curriculum will not bring freedom. Right? Even access to higher education, getting that ticket out of the hood, is not going to bring us collective freedom. Right? But that's not to say then we shouldn't go to college. Right? The language I'm speaking right now is English. That's a colonizer's language. My family's language was Spanish, but you know what? Spanish is a colonizer's language too. Right? I don't know the original indigenous language my family, from where my family came. But that doesn't then limit me and say that I shouldn't communicate ideas in the language that I use. Right? Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say? So it's not a universal rejection of reform or working within institutions. We can be in an institution, but not of it. The distinction is important. So to conclude, Ella Baker's reminder still rings true today. As we struggle, whether it was in Obama's neoliberal era or now Trump's authoritarian era, the rise of fascism across the globe, deepening economic inequalities under capitalism, an escalating climate crisis in which Mother Earth and all our non-human relations are under attack, a racialized carceral state imprisoning generations of black and brown folk, we have to understand that it's still true that what is at stake is every aspect of life, as she says. And it is still a global struggle. And we benefit if we tap into the wisdom, that subjugated wisdom of those who came before us. And you here at the College of San Mateo are connected to that. You are part of, whether you realize it or not, a larger tradition of struggle, part of a rich and deep history, one that is ongoing. in which chapters are still being written. You stand on the shoulders of tremendous individuals and collective groups that made sacrifices so that you could be here, in this space, doing what you're doing. No matter how contradictory or compromised these spaces may be. But also, you have a responsibility. That's the heavy part. What are you going to do to make sure that this space doesn't just continue to exist, but expands? That's the challenge you have today. So I want to close with a quote. There's a great new book out called Our History is the Future. It just came out last week by Nick Estes, native historian, and it's about Standing Rock and the long tradition of indigenous resistance. And I figured, since we're standing on native land, I want to end with some wisdom from Indian country. In this book, in his preface, he says, how does one relate to the past? Settler narratives use a linear conception of time, but indigenous notions of time consider the present to be structured entirely by our past and our ancestors. There is no separation between past and present, meaning that an alternative future is also determined by our understanding of our past. Our history is the future.